So hello and welcome to this NPTEL course, Introduction to Culture Studies, where we're looking at Michel Foucault's essay, What is an Author? So we've already started with the essay. We had one lecture on the essay already, and we continue with this essay in this lecture as well, looking at some of the key sections from this text. So the last time we stopped at how Foucault examines the paradox. So in postmodern times, the author is, maintained, the author is preserved through an absence. Right, so the absence of the author becomes the transcendental signified, which actually keeps him alive, paradoxically. So it has a similar structural principle to that of religious texts. So it makes a commonality. He examines the commonality between religious criticism and literary criticism or critical analysis over here, which both rely on the absence, which both create the author in terms of looking at it from two different perspectives. The religious perspective is obviously to make him immortal, and the critical perspective is to make him absolutely absent. And by making him absolutely absent, they make him the paradoxically produce the image of the author over and over again. So, and as it goes on to say, and this should be on the screen, this usage of the notion of writing runs the risk of maintaining the author's privileges under the protection of the a priori. It keeps alive, in the grey light of neutralization, the interplay of those representations that formed a particular image of the author. So the author's image is maintained, the author's image is resurrected, is made alive with this idea of critical interplay. The author's disappearance, since Mallarmé has been a constantly recurring event, is subject to a series of transcendental barriers. There seems to be an important dividing line between those who believe that they can still locate today's discontinuities or ruptures in the historical transcendental tradition of the 19th century, and those who try to free themselves once and for all from that tradition. Okay, so this disappearance of the author is something as an event, as a phenomenon that Foucault traces back since Mallarmé's times. Okay, now then he moves on to the idea of looking at the figure of the author as a godlike presence, as in commonality with God. So God, obviously, we are becoming a signifier of authority, signifier of the maker, the creator, etc. And so it has some kind of functional and structural similarity with the way the author is situated apropos of the text. And he says, and this should be on the screen again, it is not enough, however, to repeat the empty affirmation that the author has disappeared. So, it's a bit of a cliche to say the author has disappeared, and by making him disappear transcendentally, we actually replicate the image, the presence of the author in a paradoxical sense. So, this is a classic case in point where absence becomes paradoxical production, right? So, it's paradoxically produced by being absent. So something is produced by not being there, by not being absolutely there. So this absolute absence becomes the paradoxical presence over here in some sense. For the same reason, it is not enough to keep repeating that God and man have died a common death. Instead, we must locate the space left empty by the author's disappearance, follow the distribution of gaps and breaches, and watch for the openings this disappearance uncovers. So, this is a very interesting and a deeply post-structuralist analysis that Foucault is doing over here. So he's saying, instead of just saying the author is dead, the author's disappeared completely, which in a way paradoxically produces or reproduces the image of the author, we should look at the very interstitial relationship between the author and the text, the gaps between the author and the text, the gaps in the disappearance, so the very liminality of the author's absent presence. These are the things that we should be examining instead of just giving a very blunt binary of the dead author versus the alive text, because that wouldn't work at all. That would just replicate the structures of ancient traditions by keeping the author alive through deadness. Okay, so instead of that, Foucault is doing away with the binaries, doing away with this dead-alive binary, and looking at the liminal spaces where the author is half alive, the author is half present, the author is interstitially present as a category, as a function, etc. And therein lies the post-structuralist potential of this particular essay. Okay, so what are the things we need to do? First, we need to clarify briefly the problems arising from the use of author's name. What is an author's name? How does it function? Far from offering a solution, I shall only indicate some of the difficulties that it presents. So again, in true blue post-structuralist fashion, Foucault is not interested in giving a solution, he's instead offering you more problems, right? So he's saying one of the things we should ask ourselves directly, a very blunt, pragmatic question is the question of the author's name. Malame, for instance, or Kafka, for instance. So, what is the author's name? How do you define the author's name? What are the markings of an author's name? So, is the author's name a proper name, or is it more than that? Is it more complex than that? These are questions that Foucault is asking over here. So, the author's name is a proper name, of course. It is a proper name of someone's name, and therefore it raises the problems common to all proper names. Here I refer to Searle's analysis, among others. So this psychology of the proper name and common name and author's name is something that Foucault is drawing on. Obviously, one cannot turn a proper name into a pure and simple reference. It has other than indicative functions, more than an indication, a gesture, a finger pointed at someone. Is the equivalent of a description. When one says Aristotle, one employs a word that is an equivalent of one or a series of definite descriptions, such as the author of the Analytics, the founder of ontology, and so forth. So the name Aristotle is not just a proper name. It becomes a marker. It becomes an epistemic marker to a certain extent. It uncovers or it evokes a range of indicative functions. So you can think of Nicomachean ethics. We can think of politics. We can think of poetics. We can think of analytics. A series of references will come condensed in the name Aristotle here. So one employs a word that is the equivalent of one or a series of definite descriptions, such as the author of analytics, the founder of ontology, and so forth. One cannot stop there, however, because a proper name does not have just one signification. When we discovered that Arthur Rimbaud did not write a large essay, Spirituelle, we cannot pretend that the meaning of this proper name or that of the author has been altered. The proper name and the author's name are situated between the two poles of description and designation. They must have a certain link with what the name, but that one that is neither entirely in a mode of designation nor in that of description. It must be a specific link. So he's looking at the author's name as a play between designation and description, right? So when we designate someone, when we address someone with the proper name, that's designation. But the author's name is more than just designation. It also becomes a description, and it's a play between description and designation that Foucault is unpacking over here in a very post-structuralist sense. Okay. However, and it is here that the particular difficulties of the author's name arise. The links between the proper name and the individual names named, and between the author's name and what it names, are not isomorphic and do not function in the same way. There are several differences. So these are not straight isomorphic functions. These are very complex functions, the proper name and the author's name. So these are designations, descriptions, combination of both, etc. Okay. If, for example, Pierre Dupin does not have blue eyes, always born in Paris, always not a doctor, the name Pierre Dupin will still always refer to the same person. Such things do not modify the link of designation, right? So when you look at a name as a purely a designated category, just a name of a person, it doesn't matter whether that person was not born in a particular time, was not born in a particular place. The designation will be unaltered. So Pierre Dupin is a random name that Foucault is offering away here. And he's saying, if Pierre Dupin does not have blue eyes, not born in Paris, or is not a doctor, the name Pierre Dupin will still have refer to the same person. So, those factual inconsistencies, those factual alterations will not matter at all if it's just a designated category that we're talking about. Such things do not modify the link of designation. So if it's purely a designated category, just a link of designation, that would stay unchanged, in this kind of a system. The problems raised by the author's name are much more complex. However, if I discover that Shakespeare was not born in a house we visit today, this is a modification that obviously will not alter the functioning of the author's name. But if we prove that Shakespeare did not write those sonnets which pass for us, that would constitute a significant change and affect the manner in which the author's name functions. Now, obviously, now we're moving into a more functional category over here. And Foucault says quite clearly that the author's name depends not just on designation, but also on description, on performances, on utterances, on creation. So suppose you find out that what we now call Shakespeare sonnets were actually written by someone else. That would definitely alter or change the way we refer to Shakespeare as a writer, right? So the author's name becomes something more than just a proper name in this example. Okay. So if you prove that Shakespeare wrote Bacon's Organon by showing that the same author wrote both the works of Bacon and those of Shakespeare, that would be a third type of change that would entirely modify the functioning of the author's name. The author's name is not, therefore, just a proper name like the rest. So this particular passage is a magnificent description of the ontology of the author's name. So what function does the author's name carry? The author's name is not just a proper name. It's not just a male British playwright that we talk about when we say Shakespeare. When we say Shakespeare, we have a range of texts in our mind, a range of works in our mind. And those works constitute the author, right? And that's a very important category. That's a very important function. It's a very important construct. So the author's name becomes a construct of activities, construct of creations. And if those constructs change, if the coordinates of the constructs change through historical analysis, through critical analysis, then obviously the author's name changes as well, in the same way that a proper name, a purely proper name, would not change, because a purely proper name is just a designation, not a description. Okay, right. Many of the facts point out the paradoxical singularity of the author's name. To say that Pierre Dupont does not exist at all, is all the same as saying as Homer or Hermes Trismegistus did not exist. In the first case, it means that no one has the name Pierre Dupont. In the second, it means that several people were mixed together under one name, or that a true author had none of the traits traditionally ascribed to the personae of Homer or Hermes. So if, for instance, Foucault says quite clearly, if someone says Pierre Dupont doesn't exist, it just means the person doesn't exist and nothing more. But if it's not the same as saying that Homer doesn't exist, because if you say Homer doesn't exist, or Hermes, Trismegistus doesn't exist, if you say those things, that means actually that all the works that we ascribe to Homer, all the works attributed to Homer, were probably written by different people at different points of time. So that is a different kind of a change, and that actually involves works, that involves writing, that involves reception as well. Okay, which is not the case when we just name a person randomly who's not an author. Okay. And the same goes for any artist. So you can talk about Picasso in this way, you can talk about Van Gogh in this way, or even filmmakers this way as well. Okay, to say that X's real name is actually Jacques Durand instead of Pierre Dupont is not the same as saying that Stendhal's name was Henry Bale. One could also question the meaning and functioning of propositions like Bourbaki is so-and-so, so-and-so, and so forth, and Victor Eremide, Climacus, Anticlimacus, Praetor Taciturnus, Constantine, Constantinus, all of these are Kierkegaard. So, he's giving absurd examples over here to hammer home the point that the author's name is related to style. It cannot be possibly divorced from the works. If you're changing the works, it also changes the author's name, but you can just change a normal proper name and nothing will change. Okay, so these differences may result from the fact that the author's name is not simply an element in a discourse. It performs a certain role with regard to narrative discourse. This is a very important fact that Foucault is pointing out, that the author's name performs a certain role with regard to narrative discourse, and it's a narrative discourse which is commonly consumed, commonly shared by generations of people, assuring a classificatory function. Such a name permits one to group together a certain number of texts, define them, differentiate them from, and contrast them to others. So, the author's name becomes an extension really of a range of texts which we can bring together, which we can classify together, and which we can discuss in contrast to other texts written by other authors. So they all belong to different narrative discourses, and the narrative discursivity is something that must be highlighted when we take author's name, according to Foucault's analysis over here. Okay, in addition, it establishes a relationship among the texts. Hermes Trismegistus did not exist, not did Hippocrates, in the sense that Balzac existed. But the fact that the several texts have been placed on the same name indicates there has been established among them a relationship of homogeneity, filiation, authentication of some texts by the use of others, reciprocal explication, or concomitant utilization. So, say for instance, Homer did not exist in the same way as James Joyce did, right? But at the same time, there are certain Homeric works which are brought together, which have a certain affiliation to a person called Homer, or maybe a series of persons called Homer. So in that sense, the author's name also functions as a homogeneous construct, as a construct of creation, right? So, he's talking, obviously, what Foucault is mentioning is the difference between a pre-print culture and a post-print culture, right? In a post-print culture, the author's name is much more permanent, it's much more attached to the text. But if you go back to ancient times, no one quite knows if Homer was really a man Was he just a single person, or did he write? Were the different people writing the name of Homer, etc.? We don't know that, but that doesn't matter, because what matters is how the texts, which we now consider to be Homeric in tradition, they have a certain affiliation, a certain homogeneity, a certain connectivity as a works of art, as in rhetoric discourses, and that connectivity is what constitutes the author's name. Okay, the author's name serves to characterize a certain mode of being to a discourse. So this is a brilliant, brilliant sentence, really. The author's name is meant to characterize a certain mode of being, a certain mode of being of discourse. So it becomes a marker for discursivity, a marker for a unique discursivity, a marker for a unique discursive quality, right? So the author's name becomes a marker. So a certain kind of writing is produced under the certain head, Homer, or Balzac, or Shakespeare, or anyone for the matter, right? And that markers become very important in terms of looking at authors' names as a discursive formation. So the fact that a discourse has an author's name, that one can say this was written by so and so is its author, shows that this discourse is not ordinary everyday speech that merely comes and goes, not something that's immediately consumable. On the contrary, it's a speech that must be received in a certain mode, and that in a given culture must receive a certain status. So the status of a particular author becomes very important. It's not just a flash, it's not just a temporary thing, it's not just something which comes and goes, which is immediately consumable, right? So it's a particular mode, a particular marker that in a particular given culture receives certain status. So any author, any big author, any person who is a big author and a recognized author exists in a certain status in a certain society, right? And that status must be a marker for a certain discourse which the author is producing through his or her works. Okay, it would seem that the author's name, unlike other proper names, does not pass from the interior of a discourse to the real or an exterior individual who produced it. Instead, the name always seems to be present, marking out the edges of the text, revealing or at least characterizing its mode of being. So, it's a name which characterizes the mode of being. The very ontology of the text is dependent on the author's name in a certain sense. The author's name manifests the appearance of a certain discursive set and indicates the status of this discourse within a society and a culture. It has no legal status, nor is it located in a fiction of the work. Rather, it is located in the breadth that founds a certain discursive construct and its very particular mode of being. As a result, we could say that in a civilization like ours, there are certain number of discourses endowed with the author function, while others are deprived of it. So, Foucault says quite clearly, we are in a civilization, there are a certain number of discourses which have author function, and certain discourses do not have author functions, right? And we just looked at what author function is. And author function becomes a mode, a marker for a certain kind of discursivity, a certain unique discursivity. So the author becomes a marker of a certain discursive category, a certain narrative category. And Foucault says in our civilization we have discourses which have that kind of an authorship and discourses which do not have any authorship at all. We are marked by two different kinds of discourses, one with author function, one without author function, one deprived of author function in the civilization like our own, though we will live in today. A private letter may well have a signer, it does not have an author. A contract may well have a guarantor, it does not have an author. An anonymous text posted on a wall probably has an editor, but not an author. The author function is therefore characteristic of the mode of existence, circulation, and functioning of certain discourses within a society. So what we see, and we will conclude with this now, what we see over here quite clearly is that an author, according to Foucault, becomes, designs a certain discursivity. It becomes a marker for a certain discursivity, and this discursive quality is what Foucault is interested in, because he says a letter can have a writer, a letter can have a signer, but that wouldn't make it an author. A contract, whatever contract that is, whether it's a tenancy contract, a loan contract, some kind of a bond, whatever contract that is, it will have a guarantor, but not an author. It will have someone who signs it, but that will not make the person the author of it. The anonymous text posted on the wall probably has an editor, someone who edits it, someone who changes it, etc., but not an author. The author function is discursive in quality, so you can't take away the discursivity from the author function at all. And again, this brings us back to one of the key things which we've been interested in, and we've been examining this from the very inception of the course, the relationship between corporeality, identity, and discursivity. So identity and discursivity are related to each other in very organic ways, and Foucault is obviously very, very interested in the organicity of this entanglement between identity and discursivity. So the author becomes a function for discursivity. The author becomes a discursivity phenomenon, and we can't take away a marker for discursivity, and we can't take away the marker of the author. If you change the text, for instance, if you change the markers of discursivity, then author function changes as well. So, for instance, if someone comes and tells us today Shakespeare did not write Hamlet, someone else wrote Hamlet, Thomas Kidd wrote Hamlet, if that kind of argument is proved, then obviously the very ontology of Shakespeare as an author will change, because it is dependent on the discursivity which is created by the narrative discourse, which is the series of works that Shakespeare had created. And Shakespeare is just an example that I've offered you in terms of understanding what Foucault was saying. So we'll conclude with that in this lecture, and we'll sort of hopefully wrap up this particular text in a couple of lectures to come. So thank you for your attention, and please go back and read the text, read the sections which we have been examining in close details. And I'll see you in the next lecture. Thank you.